Richard Harrington's home was the kind of place people slowed their cars to look at, even if they pretended not to. It stood on a quiet hill just outside the city, a sleek, modern mansion of glass, steel, and stone. Every line of it was sharp and deliberate, as though the architect had cut it from the hillside with a surgeon's precision. Inside, everything gleamed, not a thing out of place, not a speck of dust on the marble floors. The house felt like an extension of Richard himself. He was a man who lived by control. A widower for 5 years now, he had raised his only son, Ethan, with a meticulous sense of responsibility. Ethan was 10 years old, with a delicate, fine-boned face and dark eyes that often darted away from whoever was speaking. He had been diagnosed with autism when he was 3. Since then, every decision Richard made revolved around ensuring his son received the best doctors, the best therapies, the best learning specialists. In the Harrington household, Ethan's days were built like clockwork: speech therapy at 9, occupational therapy at 11, lunch at 1, reading exercises at 2, and a walk in the garden at 3. Every session was led by a certified professional with a framed degree and a track record. Richard believed in experts. Experts had a plan. Experts followed protocols. Experts didn't make mistakes. And so, when Maya arrived a year ago as part of the household staff, Richard barely noticed her beyond the occasional polite nod. She was quiet, efficient, and unobtrusive, the sort of house help who could clean an entire room without anyone realizing she had been there. She was in her mid-20s, with warm brown skin, hair always pulled back in a simple braid, and an air of gentleness that seemed to soften the edges of even the coldest room. Richard had no reason to think she had any involvement in Ethan's education. Her duties were in the background. Laundry, tidying, preparing snacks, managing the smaller domestic details that kept the household running smoothly. Ethan seemed to like her, though. He sometimes followed her into the kitchen, hovering silently as she sliced fruit or stirred a pot of soup. She never pushed conversation on him, but she always had a small smile ready, as though she was letting him decide if the moment was worth filling with words. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Richard came home earlier than expected. He had been in the city for a board meeting that ended ahead of schedule, and the thought of escaping the gray drizzle into the comfort of his home was enough to make him skip his usual post-meeting dinner. He stepped through the front door, brushing droplets from his coat, and noticed something unusual: the soft hum of voices coming from the library. The library was his sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a long oak table, and a reading nook by the tall windows. It was where he spent late nights going through reports or, on rare occasions, losing himself in a novel. Ethan rarely entered the room without a therapist present. But now, the boy was there, seated at the table, and beside him sat Maya. She was leaning slightly forward, pointing at an open book. Ethan's small finger traced the lines of text. "Giraffes live in grass lands," Ethan said slowly, his voice uncertain but steady. Maya nodded encouragingly. "Yes. Grasslands. Very good, Ethan." The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile, his eyes bright for a brief moment before returning to the page. Richard froze in the doorway. Something hot and sharp rose in his chest, not anger exactly, but a jolt of alarm. This was not part of the plan. "Maya," he said, his tone clipped. She looked up quickly, her expression shifting from focus to surprise. "Mr. Harrington. I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly." He stepped inside, his gaze moving from her to Ethan. "What's going on here?" Ethan glanced between them, then looked back down at the book as though it might shield him from the tension now thickening the air. "I was just helping Ethan with his reading," Maya said, closing the book slightly but not pushing it away. "He asked me to." Richard's jaw tightened. "Helping him? You're not his tutor. You're not qualified." "I wasn't doing anything complicated," she replied calmly. "Just reading together." "That's exactly the problem," Richard said, his voice dropping into a lower register. "Ethan's learning is guided by trained specialists. People who understand his needs. This, he gestured to the book between them, isn't part of his program. You could be doing more harm than good. Maya's eyes didn't flinch, but there was something behind them, a quiet steadiness, as if she'd expected this reaction. With respect, sir, I'm not replacing his specialists. I'm just giving him my time. Richard exhaled sharply, fighting the urge to raise his voice. Time isn't enough, Maya. Hope isn't enough. We follow a structure for a reason. Ethan's shoulders hunched slightly. He pulled the book toward himself, as if to protect it. Richard noticed and felt a small pang of guilt, but it was buried under his conviction. This stops now, he said, his tone final. Ethan's education is not a casual matter. You will leave it to the professionals. Maya closed the book fully and stood. Understood, she said, though there was something in her voice that suggested she did not, in fact, agree. Richard turned to leave, his mind already moving on to the next meeting he had to prepare for. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the image of Ethan's smile, a rare, unguarded thing, just before he had interrupted. That night, the rain continued, tapping against the wide windows as the city lights shimmered in the distance. Richard sat in his study, reviewing quarterly reports, but his mind kept wandering back to the library. He had built his life around protecting his son from disappointment. He had seen too many promises made by well-meaning amateurs crumble, leaving Ethan frustrated, retreating further into himself. He wouldn't let that happen again. But somewhere deep inside, another thought lingered, stubborn and quiet: if what Maya had been doing was wrong, why had Ethan looked so happy? The next morning began like any other in the Harrington household, at least on the surface. The chefs prepared breakfast in the sleek kitchen, the housekeepers moved silently from room to room, and Ethan sat at the long dining table, his plate arranged just the way he liked it, toast cut into even halves, scrambled eggs soft but not runny, a small bowl of strawberries off to the side. Richard read the news on his tablet while sipping his coffee, occasionally glancing at his son to make sure he was eating. Across the room, Maya moved between the counter and the table, refilling water glasses and carrying in fresh fruit. She was as composed as always, but Richard couldn't help noticing a subtle shift. Her movements were perhaps a shade slower, her focus just a bit too fixed on the tasks at hand. He knew why. Their exchange in the library the previous afternoon had not been resolved, not really. And it was going to have to be. After breakfast, Ethan's reading specialist arrived, a tall woman with bright scarves and an encouraging but brisk demeanor. Richard stood with her at the front door for a moment, discussing Ethan's recent progress. He nodded along, but when she left, he noticed something. Ethan was watching her go with a kind of quiet relief, the same way some children looked after a dentist appointment. Richard decided to wait until later to speak to Maya, but Ethan made that impossible. As soon as the specialist's car disappeared down the drive, the boy padded into the kitchen where Maya was loading the dishwasher. "Can we read?" Ethan asked softly, glancing over his shoulder as though someone might overhear. Maya looked up, a faint crease appearing between her brows. "Ethan, I don't think." Richard stepped in before she could finish. "Ethan, your reading time is with Ms. Keating. You know that." "But she makes it loud," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maya makes it quiet. And fun." The words hung in the air for a moment, almost fragile in their simplicity. Richard felt them press against something in him, but he pushed back. "Ethan," he said gently but firmly, "Miss Keating is trained to help you. Maya isn't. If we mix things up, it could confuse you and make learning harder." Ethan's face fell, and he retreated a step. Maya dried her hands on a towel, her gaze flicking between father and son. "Mr. Harrington," she began carefully, "I understand your concern. But I'm not trying to replace anyone. Ethan asked me to help, and I." "And you overstepped," Richard cut in, his voice sharper than he intended. "This isn't about kindness or good intentions. This is about doing what's best for him, in the right way." "I believe this is the right way," Maya said quietly, but there was a firmness in her tone that surprised him. Not instead of the specialists, alongside them. Sometimes children learn in small, quiet ways, in moments that aren't scheduled or formal. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Richard felt his temper flare. Belief doesn't make you qualified. Hope doesn't make you an expert. I have spent years making sure Ethan gets the very best care possible, because I won't gamble with his progress. I'm not gambling, she said. I'm giving him space. And I believe in his abilities, maybe more than he does yet. Ethan was still there, standing small between them, looking from one to the other as though trying to make sense of a language only adults understood. Richard took a breath, forcing himself to lower his voice. Maya, I appreciate your intentions. But from now on, you will not tutor Ethan in any way. Read to him if you want, as a story before bed, but no more teaching. Leave that to the people who know what they're doing. Maya held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Understood, sir. It should have felt like a victory, clear boundaries re-established, order restored. But as the day went on, Richard found himself unsettled. He thought about Ethan's choice of words that morning, quiet and fun. He remembered the ease in his son's posture when reading with Maya, so different from the slightly stiff way he sat with his specialist. Still, he reminded himself, feelings were not a substitute for evidence. There was no proof that this unsupervised reading would help him. And yet, there was no proof it wouldn't. That evening, Richard lingered in the library after finishing some paperwork. He picked up one of the books from the low shelf, a children's story with bright illustrations and large print. The kind Maya had been using with Ethan. He turned the pages slowly, wondering if perhaps the simplicity was what drew Ethan in. When he went upstairs to check on his son, he found him in bed, eyes open in the dim light. Couldn't sleep? Richard asked. Ethan shook his head. Want me to read to you? The boy hesitated, then said, Can Maya? Richard forced a small smile. Not tonight, buddy. But maybe I will. He read for 10 minutes before Ethan's eyes finally closed. But even then, Richard couldn't shake the thought that his son had not asked for him. Downstairs, Maya was wiping the counters in the kitchen. Richard paused at the doorway, watching her for a moment. She didn't notice him, and there was something about the unhurried way she moved that felt steady. Safe. The same way Ethan seemed to feel when sitting beside her. He turned away without saying anything. His mind told him he was right to set limits. But something deeper whispered that maybe, just maybe, limits were not always where the answer lived. The days that followed slipped into their usual rhythm, at least in appearance. Richard's business meetings came and went, the specialists arrived at the house at their appointed times, and the staff moved quietly through the daily chores. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that surface, something was shifting. It began on a quiet Saturday morning when Richard left early for a charity breakfast downtown. The sky was still pale with the kind of light that makes the air feel softer, and the house seemed unusually still. Ethan was in the kitchen, nibbling on a piece of toast while Maya chopped fruit for a platter. He glanced up at her. Do you have time? She paused mid-slice, reading his face. For what? Ethan hesitated, then whispered, reading. Maya's eyes flicked toward the hallway, half expecting Richard to appear out of nowhere. But the house was silent. She set down the knife and nodded once. All right. Just a little. They settled into a corner of the library, where the morning light poured in through the tall windows, softening the edges of the room. Maya pulled out a slim book from her bag, one she had borrowed from the public library the day before. The cover showed a small boy standing in a field of tall grass, staring up at the sky. This one's about a boy who wants to see the stars, she told him. Ethan's eyes traced the picture before he carefully opened the first page. He read slowly, stumbling over a few words, but Maya didn't interrupt. She let him finish each sentence before quietly repeating the tricky words, never making him feel small for getting them wrong. He dreamed of the night sky, Ethan read. What's dreamed? It's when you think of something you want or imagine while you're asleep, or sometimes even when you're awake, Maya explained. Like when you think about something you hope for. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I dream about, quiet. Her throat tightened, but she smiled. That's a good dream. From then on, their reading sessions became a secret woven into the spaces of the day. Sometimes it was 15 minutes before lunch, sometimes while waiting for his therapy sessions to begin, and sometimes in the garden under the shade of the tall maple trees. Maya never pushed, she always waited for Ethan to ask. And he asked often. Each time, she noticed small changes in him, the way his voice grew steadier, the way he no longer avoided eye contact with the page, the way he began asking questions about the stories. She brought books with gentle pacing and soft illustrations, sensing that too many bright colors or busy pages could overwhelm him. One afternoon, they read a story about a fox and a turtle. When they finished, Ethan stared at the picture of the turtle for a long time. The turtle's slow, he said. Yes, Maya agreed. But he gets where he needs to go. He doesn't stop just because he's slow. Ethan nodded, as though storing the thought away. Maya had learned to see the world the way he did, in smaller, quieter pieces. She noticed how certain noises made him tense, how sudden movements caused him to flinch, how he needed pauses between questions to think before answering. She adapted to him without making it obvious, and he responded in ways she doubted Richard had ever seen. But secrecy has a way of creating its own kind of tension. Richard's sister, Claudia, visited one afternoon, sweeping into the house with her usual crisp perfume and air of mild disapproval. She adored Ethan in her own way, but her version of affection often came with prescriptions, lists of what should be done, changed, improved. Richard tells me Ethan is doing better with his reading specialist, Claudia said to Maya while the boy was in another room. I hope you aren't interfering with that progress. I'm not interfering, Maya replied evenly, careful not to reveal too much. Good, Claudia said, though her tone was edged. Children like Ethan need structure, not well-meaning distractions. The word stung, but Maya kept her composure. Of course. Later that day, as she dusted the library shelves, she thought about Claudia's words, how easily people dismissed anything that didn't come with a framed certificate. She wasn't trying to be a replacement for the professionals. She was simply offering something no degree could guarantee, patience without a stopwatch, encouragement without conditions. One rainy afternoon, when Richard was delayed at the office, Ethan curled up on the library sofa with a book about ocean animals. He had chosen it himself, his small hands holding the edges carefully as if the pages were fragile. Did you know, he told Maya with a hint of excitement, that whales can talk to each other across oceans? Maya smiled. I didn't. That's amazing. They use sounds, he said slowly. Not words. But they still understand. She nodded. Kind of like how you and I understand each other sometimes, even without saying much. Ethan looked up at her then, really looked, and something in his expression told her that he knew exactly what she meant. As the weeks passed, Ethan's confidence began to show in subtle ways. He started to volunteer to read aloud in small bursts during his official sessions, though he never mentioned Maya's name. She didn't need him to. She could see it in the way he sat a little taller, the way his voice no longer trailed off halfway through a sentence. But their quiet progress was under constant threat of discovery. More than once, Maya heard footsteps in the hall and quickly closed a book, pretending to dust or arrange the shelves. Other times, Ethan would tuck a book behind a cushion when he heard the sound of his father's voice. Still, neither of them spoke of stopping. It was one of those hidden moments, the kind that feels almost like a stolen treasure, that set the stage for everything to come. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the library rug, reading a story about a young boy who built a kite and entered it into a town contest. When he finished, he looked up at Maya with a spark she hadn't seen before. "Could I be in a contest?" he asked. "What kind of contest?" she said, curious. "Reading. Like this." Maya's heart tightened. She thought of Richard's reaction. The way his voice would harden, the certainty with which he dismissed anything that didn't fit the professional plan. But she also thought of the boy in front of her, the boy who had once whispered that he dreamed of quiet. She smiled slowly. "If you want to, Ethan, yes. You could." The boy nodded once, as though a decision had been made. In that moment, Maya understood something with absolute clarity. The greatest risk wasn't giving him hope, it was letting him believe he didn't deserve it. The Harrington estate, for all its quiet elegance, had a way of amplifying whispers. A raised voice could travel down the marble hallways, a soft conversation in the kitchen could drift up the grand staircase. And when something unusual was happening, something unspoken, it didn't take long for the household to sense it. By now, Maya and Ethan's secret reading sessions had woven themselves into the fabric of their days, a hidden thread in the pattern of the household routine. But those threads, invisible as they felt to the two of them, were beginning to show to others. It started subtly. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Granger, began lingering a little longer in the library when dusting, her eyes flicking toward the table where Ethan sometimes sat with a book in hand. The gardener, who often saw them reading beneath the maple trees, mentioned to the cook in passing that the boy's talking more these days. And then there was Claudia. Richard's sister had always been quick to notice anything that strayed from her brother's meticulously ordered plans. Her visits were less about affection and more about auditing, subtle inspections wrapped in polite conversation. She had a way of looking at Maya that felt like she was weighing her value on a scale. On one Tuesday afternoon, Claudia arrived without warning. The rain had let up just enough to leave the driveway slick and shining, and she swept into the foyer in her usual tailored coat, shaking off her umbrella. "Maya," she said, spotting her in the hallway. "Where's Ethan?" "In the library, ma'am," Maya replied, careful to keep her voice neutral. Claudia narrowed her eyes slightly. "With his specialist?" "No, ma'am. He's looking at books." "Alone?" "Yes." Claudia's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she walked to the library. Ethan was there, just as Maya had said, tracing the illustrations in a picture book about the solar system. He looked up at his aunt briefly, then back at the page. "Reading on your own?" Claudia asked, her tone overly bright. Ethan gave a small nod. "That's nice," she said, though her expression suggested she found it questionable. When she left the room, she caught Maya in the hall. "I hope you're not confusing him by mixing your reading games with his professional work," Claudia said, her words crisp. "You could undo months of progress." "I'm not undoing anything," Maya said evenly. "I'm just supporting what he's already learning." Claudia's smile was thin. "Support comes from trained people, dear. Not from housemaids with library cards." The remark was meant to sting, and it did. But Maya's face didn't change. She simply nodded, then walked away before Claudia could say more. That night, as she folded laundry in the staff quarters, Maya thought about the conversation. Claudia saw Ethan's learning as something fragile, something that could shatter if handled by the wrong hands. But Maya didn't see him that way. Yes, he was careful with words, hesitant in social moments, but there was a strength in him too, one that grew each time he conquered a page or asked a question. If anything was fragile, Maya thought, it was the faith others had in him. And that was what she was trying to strengthen. Still, the pressure was building. The staff, once warm and easy with her, began to keep a certain polite distance. She caught fragments of conversations, "She's getting too involved," or "Richard won't like it," that made her chest tighten. Ethan sensed it too. One afternoon in the garden, as they sat on the grass with a book about forest animals, he asked quietly, "Are you in trouble?" The question made her look up sharply. "Why would you think that?" Because people look different at you now. She closed the book, meeting his gaze. Sometimes people don't understand things that are new or different. That doesn't make them bad people. It just means they're not ready to see it yet. He thought about that for a moment. Are you going to stop? Maya smiled faintly. No. Not unless you want me to. He shook his head quickly. No. From then on, their sessions became even more careful. They read in the far corners of the garden where the hedges were tall, or in the small upstairs lounge that most of the staff never entered. Sometimes they didn't read at all, just talked about the stories Ethan wanted to write one day. He began inventing characters, a shy rabbit who learned to sing, a turtle who built a boat to cross a big lake, and Maya encouraged him to tell her each part before they wrote it down. The stories, she noticed, often mirrored his own quiet struggles, but they always ended in triumph. Richard remained unaware, though he did notice something. Ethan's confidence in his official sessions seemed to be improving. He mentioned it to Ms. Keating, the reading specialist, who chalked it up to breakthrough weeks that sometimes happened with children like Ethan. Richard was pleased, but not curious enough to look deeper. Not yet. The turning point came one Friday evening when Maya was carrying a tray of tea to the sitting room. Richard and Claudia were there, discussing upcoming family commitments, when Claudia said, "You know, Richard, I've noticed Ethan reading a lot more lately, but not with his specialist. With Maya." Richard's gaze shifted sharply. "What do you mean?" Claudia leaned back, crossing her legs. "Exactly what I said. She's been taking it upon herself to tutor him. I warned her it was inappropriate, but apparently, she didn't listen." Maya stood very still, the tray balanced in her hands. Richard's eyes met hers, and in that moment she knew the small sanctuary she and Ethan had built was about to be tested. He didn't say anything then, not in front of Claudia. But the air between them was no longer neutral, it carried the weight of questions, of a confrontation waiting just beyond the next corner. That night, Maya sat alone in her small room, staring at the stack of children's books on her nightstand. The easy thing would be to stop. To let the professionals handle everything, to avoid the disapproval and the risk. But she thought of Ethan's face when he sounded out a difficult word, the way his shoulders straightened when he finished a page without help. She thought of the boy who once whispered that he dreamed of quiet, and how that quiet was becoming something he could carry with him. No, she decided. She wouldn't stop. Not yet. What she didn't know was that the decision she made that night would lead to the moment everything changed, the moment Ethan would take the skills they'd nurtured in secret and step into a world far bigger than either of them had imagined. The morning it began, the Harrington estate was wrapped in the pale gold light of early autumn. The maple trees that lined the long driveway were beginning to shift from deep green to shades of amber and rust. Inside, the house was alive with its usual quiet hum, the soft clink of breakfast dishes in the kitchen, the muffled steps of staff moving between rooms. Maya was in the pantry, restocking shelves, when she heard the sound of Ethan's footsteps. He appeared in the doorway, clutching something in both hands. His expression was part excitement, part hesitation, as though he wasn't entirely sure what to do with the thing he carried. "Can I show you something?" he asked. "Of course," Maya said, wiping her hands on a cloth. He stepped forward and held out a folded sheet of paper, its edges slightly crumpled from being handled too much. She unfolded it carefully. It was a flyer printed on bright blue paper, with a large heading in cheerful block letters. Citywide Children's Reading Competition, ages 8 to 12. Below the title were details, the date, the venue, the prizes, gift certificates to local bookstores, a trophy, and, for the winner, a year-long membership to the City Reading Club. Maya looked up. "Where did you get this?" "On the kitchen counter," Ethan said. "It was with the mail." She frowned slightly, realizing it must have been delivered for one of the local community bulletins Richard sometimes sponsored. It had probably been left there by the staff sorting the mail. Ethan shifted on his feet. "Do you think I could do it?" The question was soft but steady. Maya felt a mix of warmth and unease rise in her chest. "It's a competition," she said carefully. "You'd have to read in front of people. A lot of people." "I know," he said. "But I want to try." She studied his face, the way his eyes held hers without flinching, the small but certain set of his jaw. This wasn't a fleeting curiosity. This was something he had already turned over in his mind and decided mattered to him. Her instinct was to say yes immediately, but another thought pushed its way in: Richard. She could already imagine his reaction. He would see it as a distraction at best, a setback at worst. He'd talk about structure and trained professionals, about how a competition could overwhelm Ethan and undo his progress. But Maya also knew something Richard didn't: Ethan was ready. Not for perfection, not for flawless performance, but for a challenge he had chosen for himself. She folded the flyer back along its worn crease and handed it to him. "If you really want to do this, we can try. But we'll have to work hard. And it'll have to be our little secret, for now." Ethan's lips curved into a small smile. "Okay." From that day forward, their secret reading sessions took on a new energy. No longer just quiet moments of shared stories, they became deliberate practice sessions. Maya began introducing him to a range of passages, descriptive, narrative, even bits of dialogue, so he could get used to different rhythms. She focused not just on the words, but on the spaces between them. "It's like music," she explained one afternoon as they sat in the garden. "You have to let the pauses carry meaning too. Don't rush to the next note." Ethan listened closely, adjusting his pace as he read. Sometimes he stumbled, sometimes his voice dipped so low she could barely hear him, but she never corrected him sharply. Every correction was gentle, and every improvement was noticed. When he grew frustrated, and he did, on more than one occasion, she reminded him of the turtle from their earlier story. "Slow is fine," she said. "Slow still gets you there." Weeks passed in a quiet rhythm of preparation. Ethan began to read more confidently during his official sessions, though he never mentioned the competition. Ms. Keating praised his steady improvement, unaware that much of it was being shaped under maple trees and in tucked-away corners of the house. But the secrecy weighed on Maya. She avoided Claudia whenever possible and learned to listen for the faintest sound of approaching footsteps. Once, Richard passed the library door while they were practicing, and Maya had to quickly shift into small talk about the weather while Ethan closed the book. Despite the risk, there was something electric in those moments, the sense that they were building towards something that belonged to Ethan alone. One Friday afternoon, about 2 weeks before the competition, Maya brought him a book of short stories from the city library. She had marked one in particular, about a boy who planted a single seed that grew into a massive tree. The story was rich with imagery and just the right amount of challenge for Ethan's skill level. "I think this one could be perfect for the competition," she said. Ethan read through it once, halting in places, then again with more flow. By the third read, he was leaning into the rhythm, letting the words settle naturally on his tongue. When he finished, Maya clapped softly. "That," she said, "was beautiful." He looked down at the book, a faint flush creeping into his cheeks. "I like it." "Good," Maya said. "Because I think you should use it. It's about growth, patience, and something small becoming something big." Sounds like someone I know. The days before the competition became a careful balancing act. Maya had to ensure their practice didn't interfere with his official schedule, which meant early mornings before the rest of the staff arrived or quiet evenings after dinner. Sometimes she saw fatigue in his eyes, but he never complained. One evening, as they were finishing a practice session, Ethan asked, "Do you think Dad will be mad?" The question stopped her cold. "Why do you ask that?" "Because he doesn't like surprises," Ethan said simply. Maya chose her words carefully. "I think he might be surprised at first. But sometimes surprises can change people's minds." Ethan seemed to accept that. Still, She could see the thought lingering in his mind. Finally, the morning of the competition arrived. Maya had arranged to meet Ethan at the venue with the help of one of the younger house staff, who agreed to quietly drop him off under the pretense of a library event. Ethan wore a simple blue sweater and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed. He carried the book under one arm like something precious. Before he went inside, he turned to Maya. "If I get scared, will you be there?" She smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Always." Neither of them knew that Richard would soon find out exactly where his son was, and that the moment on that stage would change the way he saw both Ethan and Maya forever. The city auditorium stood in the heart of downtown, a tall brick building with wide glass doors that reflected the bustle of a Saturday morning. Inside, the air buzzed with a mix of excitement and nerves, children flipping through books one last time, parents adjusting ties and smoothing dresses, the muffled sound of a microphone being tested on stage. Maya and Ethan arrived early, giving them time to find a quiet corner near the back where the noise was softer. Ethan clutched his book tightly, his eyes scanning the room but never settling on one place for long. "You don't have to look at the whole crowd," Maya reminded him gently. "Just find one spot. Pretend you're reading to me." He nodded, his grip on the book loosening slightly. In the lobby, parents and family members filled the rows of seats, chatting among themselves. Maya kept her eyes down, focusing on Ethan, but her pulse quickened every time the doors opened. She knew Richard could walk in at any moment. Though she had done everything possible to avoid that outcome. What she didn't know was that he was already on his way. That morning, Richard had been expecting a routine Saturday. His sister Claudia had offered to take Ethan to what she claimed was a community library event, while Richard handled a late business call. But the call ended earlier than expected, and when Richard tried phoning Claudia, she didn't answer. He called the house and was told Ethan had left with one of the younger staff members, not Claudia. A ripple of unease went through him. Where exactly had his son gone? It was the gardener who, when asked, mentioned overhearing Ethan talking excitedly about a competition. Richard didn't think, he just grabbed his keys and drove into the city. When he walked into the auditorium, the sight stopped him cold. There, at the far end of the stage, a row of children sat waiting their turn. And among them, his son, small but upright in his seat, holding a book he recognized from the library at home. Maya was standing at the back of the room, her eyes fixed on Ethan. She hadn't seen Richard yet. He made his way down the side aisle, his steps quiet but heavy with questions. When he reached her, she finally turned, her eyes widening. "Richard," she said softly, almost like a warning. "What is this?" he demanded in a low voice, his eyes flicking toward the stage. "It's a children's reading competition," she said calmly. "Ethan wanted to try. You brought him here without telling me." "I helped him prepare for something he chose for himself," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in his tone. Richard shook his head, disbelief shadowing his face. "Do you have any idea how much pressure this puts on him? If he freezes up, if he fails, if he succeeds?" Maya interrupted gently. "What then?" Richard's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, the announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Next up, Ethan Harrington." The room erupted in polite applause as Ethan rose from his seat and walked toward the podium. His steps were measured, his shoulders slightly hunched, but there was no hesitation. Richard's eyes followed every movement. He could see the small tremor in his son's hands as he adjusted the microphone. The boy looked out at the crowd, his gaze flitting nervously over the sea of faces. Then his eyes found Maya. She smiled, a simple, warm curve of her lips that carried all the reassurance in the world. Ethan opened the book. His voice was soft at first, the words tentative, but each sentence seemed to anchor him a little more. The story, about the boy who planted a seed and waited patiently for it to grow, unfolded slowly, his cadence steadying with every page. Richard felt something shift inside him as he listened. This wasn't just reading. This was his son standing in a room full of strangers, speaking clearly, owning the space in a way Richard had never seen. By the time Ethan reached the last line, his voice carried a quiet strength that filled the hall. And from the smallest seed came the tallest tree, because someone believed it could grow. The audience broke into applause, louder this time. Ethan's eyes darted once more to Maya before he gave a small, almost shy smile and stepped away from the microphone. Richard realized he had been holding his breath. As Ethan returned to his seat on stage, Maya turned to Richard. "That's what I've been trying to show you," she said softly. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on his son, who was sitting straighter now, a faint flush in his cheeks. When the competition ended, Ethan didn't win first place, but he did receive a special commendation for poise and clarity. It was a small trophy, gold-painted plastic on a wooden base, but when he held it, it looked like something far greater. In the lobby afterward, Richard approached his son. "You did well, Ethan," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Ethan looked up at him. "I was scared at first. But then I saw Maya, and it was quiet." Richard glanced at Maya, who stood a few steps away, pretending to check her phone but clearly listening. On the drive home, Richard replayed the event in his mind. He couldn't deny what he had seen. His son had stood before a crowd and done something Richard hadn't thought possible. Not because of any formal program or specialist session, but because someone had given him space to grow in his own way. It unsettled him. It also humbled him. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Richard found Maya in the kitchen tidying up. She looked up when he entered, wary of what might come next. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. Her eyes widened slightly. "For what?" "For assuming you had nothing to offer him," he said. "For thinking that belief wasn't enough." Maya set down the dishcloth in her hand. "Belief is a start," she said softly. "But it only works if you act on it." Richard nodded, his gaze distant. "You acted. And I saw the result today." For the first time since she'd come to work in the Harrington home, Maya saw something in Richard's eyes she hadn't expected, not just respect, but trust. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both knew that day at the competition. The following Monday, the Harrington estate had a different feel to it. Morning light streamed in through the tall windows, spilling across the polished marble floors and glinting off the glass vases in the foyer. There was the usual quiet efficiency of staff moving through their routines, but underneath it all was something softer, almost tentative, as if the house itself was adjusting to a new rhythm. Ethan sat at the breakfast table with his trophy beside his plate, still in the same spot he'd placed it on Saturday evening. Every so often, he would glance at it and run his fingers over the smooth wooden base. It wasn't ostentatious, just a small token, but to him, it was proof. Proof that he had stood up in front of strangers and done something that had once felt impossible. Maya entered the dining room with a tray of fresh fruit, catching the way Ethan's eyes lingered on the trophy. "It looks like it belongs there," she said, setting the tray down. Ethan smiled faintly. "Do you think I could do it again? Another competition?" "You could," she said, her tone deliberately casual. "But only if it's something you want, not something anyone else expects." Before Ethan could answer, footsteps sounded from the hallway. Richard appeared in the doorway, his suit jacket draped over one arm. He greeted his son with a quiet, "Good morning," then glanced at Maya. "I'd like to speak with you after breakfast," he said. His tone was neutral, not the clipped command of a few weeks ago, but not entirely relaxed either. Maya nodded, hiding the flicker of nerves that rose in her chest. "Of course." When the dishes were cleared and Ethan had gone upstairs to get ready for his tutoring session, Richard led Maya into his study. The heavy oak door closed with a soft click, and for a moment, he just stood there, his hands in his pockets, as if searching for the right place to begin. "I've been thinking about what happened on Saturday," he said finally. "About how you went behind my back, how you took him to that competition, and about what I saw when he was on that stage." Maya kept her eyes steady on his, bracing herself for the inevitable reprimand. I've also been thinking, he continued, about why I reacted the way I did when I first learned you were tutoring him. She said nothing, letting the silence draw out until he went on. I told myself it was because I wanted the best for him, professionals, structured programs, experts. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of giving him hope only to watch him fail. Afraid that if I let myself believe he could do more than I'd been told, I'd be setting him up for disappointment, and setting myself up for it too. Maya's voice was gentle but firm when she finally spoke. Hope isn't the problem, Mr. Harrington. The problem is when you don't give someone the chance to prove themselves, with or without hope. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. And I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you the chance to keep doing what you've been doing, openly this time. Maya blinked, caught off guard. You mean? I want you to be part of his education, Richard said. Not just in the afternoons when no one's looking. I want you to work with his tutors, coordinate with them, share what you see in him. Whatever you've been doing, it's working, and I'd be a fool not to recognize that. For a moment, Maya couldn't speak. She had expected resistance, conditions, maybe even a polite dismissal after the competition. But here was an invitation, not just to stay, but to become an official part of Ethan's learning. Thank you, she said finally. But if I'm going to do this, I need your word that he won't be pressured into things he's not ready for. We can challenge him, yes, but not force him into situations where he feels trapped. Richard's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. You drive a hard bargain. But agreed. The first official week of their new arrangement felt different from the secrecy of before. Now, when Maya met with Ethan in the library or the garden, the door could stay open. Sometimes Ms. Keating would join them for a few minutes, taking notes on the techniques Maya used to help him focus. Other times, they would exchange small updates, moments of progress, words that Ethan had begun to pronounce more clearly, stories he had taken an interest in. It wasn't without its challenges. There were days when Ethan's concentration wavered, when his energy dipped and his frustration rose. But now, instead of seeing those moments as failures, Richard began to see them as part of the process, the natural ebb and flow of learning. One evening, about a month after the competition, Richard came into the library while Maya and Ethan were reading. He stood in the doorway for a moment, listening. Ethan was halfway through a passage, his voice calm, his eyes moving steadily across the page. When he finished, Maya praised him quietly. Ethan's shoulders lifted just a little higher, as though the approval was something he could physically carry. Richard stepped inside. That was excellent, Ethan, he said. Ethan looked up, startled but pleased. Thanks, Dad. Richard met Maya's gaze over his son's head. There was no need for words, the acknowledgement was there in his eyes. By spring, Ethan had entered another competition, this time with Richard sitting in the front row beside Maya. He didn't win first place, but he read with a confidence that made the placement almost irrelevant. What mattered was that he wanted to try again, not because someone had pushed him into it, but because he had discovered the quiet satisfaction of doing something he once thought he couldn't. One warm afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Ethan asked Maya, "Do you think I could write my own story one day? And read that instead?" Maya smiled. "I think you already have a story. You just haven't written it down yet." Richard, who was sitting nearby with a glass of iced tea, glanced up from his phone. "If you write it, Ethan, I'll be in the front row when you read it." Ethan grinned, the kind of open, unguarded smile that still caught both Maya and Richard off guard. And so, the boy who once hid behind silence and the man who once feared hope found themselves charting a new path together, one shaped not by rigid programs or predetermined limits, but by patience, belief, and the simple, stubborn act of showing up for each other. Maya stayed on in the Harrington household, not just as house help, but as something far more, a quiet force in the life of a boy who was learning, in his own time, to speak, to read, and to believe in himself. And for Richard, the transformation was just as real. He no longer saw belief as a fragile thing to be guarded against disappointment, but as a seed worth planting. One that, given time, could grow taller than anyone expected. Enjoyed this story? Hit subscribe for more millionaire stories that inspire and touch the heart.